The word fanatic gets thrown around an awful lot today. Our social discourse is replete with talk of bandwagons and movements and extremists. But what actually makes a fanatic? What defines a mass movement? When are they for the better, and when are they for the worse? These are just some of the questions approached by the philosopher Eric Hoffer in his book, The True Believer. He charts the growth of fanatical belief from beginning to end, and it is a truly fascinating yet utterly terrifying tale. Now, obviously, standard rules apply, and just like any text, all claims here should be thought about critically rather than accepted without examination. But let's start with the groundwork for fanaticism, because it may be a little bit more relatable than you might expect. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Sowing the Seeds. What do you think are the circumstances in which you would become a fanatic about something? What would your life have to look like for you to be swept up in a movement that would dominate your entire existence? This is Eric Hoffer's first question, and it's part of what has made his analysis so influential. Whereas many historians at the time had tended to emphasize the role of the great men of history, Hoffer begins his analysis not with the type of person who would make the charismatic leader of a fanatical movement, but with the conditions that would make ordinary people susceptible to such a leader. Hoffer considers the kind of claims that mass movements often make and concludes that they almost always have two things in common. Firstly, they claim that they will overturn everything about the pre-established status quo. Early Christianity promised the imminent arrival of the second coming of Christ, and thus an eternally just kingdom. The Jacobins of the French Revolution wanted to totally change the governmental system of France, as did the revolutionaries in early 20th century Russia. Fascists in Italy and Germany said that they would transform the nation into something entirely different. In each case, they were not promising reform or even the gradual replacement of one system with another, as we saw with the slow growth of parliamentary democracy in the UK. They pledged to swiftly clear away the old order and build a new one in its ashes. It's worth noting that Hoffer doesn't totally condemn all of these fanatical movements, although he obviously does condemn some of them. In fact, he praises the French Revolution later in the book, but he is largely content to simply observe and describe. Secondly, they said that this will happen at some point in the future. This is pretty much inevitable, since anyone promising any sort of change from what's happening now must think of that change as happening sometime after now. But Hoffer argues that the most successful mass movements can delay the arrival of this promised future almost indefinitely, and so give the impression that it is always just around the corner. Now, what situation would we have to be in to be susceptible to this kind of movement and these kinds of promises? Well, we would probably have to totally despair at our prospects in the present, yet also have just enough hope that the present can change that we're willing to throw our lot in with those who promise radical transformation. Hoffer's analysis is pretty noteworthy in that it doesn't fall into the trap of thinking that anyone who joins a mass movement or becomes a fanatic is just stupid or slow or a lazy thinker. Instead, he looks to the conditions that they are in to see when it would almost make sense for someone to become caught up in almost any movement that promises extensive and total change. Imagine that you are in truly dire straits. You feel betrayed by the promises that society has made to you, and you realize that you will never attain the life that you want. More than that, you are beset by economic and social troubles. You feel lonely, isolated, bereft of stability and security. At the same time, you've not totally lost hope. You believe that change is possible, but that it must be totalizing. In such a situation where you feel like you have nothing to lose and potentially everything to gain, it only makes sense that mass movements who are promising broad, sweeping change would be incredibly appealing. After all, the alternative is a status quo that has itself become a kind of hell. This is the first, rather straightforward motive of the person who may become a fanatic. Simply the promise of radical change is incredibly enticing to someone with no investment in the present. And they might not be wrong in this view. Surely there are situations where radical change truly is needed. Hoffer often contrasts this with a conservative instinct, but he doesn't mean conservative in our modern sense of the word. He just means a general attachment towards how things currently are that tends to emerge when you have some investment in the current political or social system. The general idea is that if you have something that could be put at risk, should there be a period of chaos or uncontrolled total upheaval, then you are likely to be more reluctant about fanaticism or radicalism in general. This doesn't have to be an economic investment. It could be stuff like family or friends or a strong community that could be threatened. One of the factors that Hoffer thinks will discourage fanaticism is the existence of social ties outside of a mass movement. But before moving on, if you want to watch out for fanaticism on your newsfeed, then you should check out today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on Elon Musk threatening to support the opponents of those who vote for Trump's upcoming budget. While left-wing sources focused on the threat this posed to Trump, right-wing sources tended to frame this decision in negative terms, calling the move incendiary. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right. This helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing news sources missing an economist with a positive appraisal of Trump's tariff policies, or right-wing sources missing the potential 12 million people that might lose their health coverage under Trump's budget. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias. So receiving my Ground News Roundup at the end of every day means that I can get a variety of news opinions, learn which sources to trust, and just make the world less of a bewildering mess. Ground News are giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. They've become my go-to news source, and I really hope that you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. Hoffer also thinks that the wannabe fanatic is likely to not just be seeking change, but also a sense of belonging. Hoffer points out that being in a desperate situation is not just unpleasant, it can feel humiliating and isolating. The feeling of being totally powerless to change your fate is embarrassing. It cuts at our sense of agency. It is no coincidence that self-esteem and a sense of control over one's fate are rather correlated. But this idea is not just empirically supported, it's totally intuitive. Personal powerlessness has been linked to misery and self-condemnation by everyone from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus to the 19th century mustachio Friedrich Nietzsche. Given all of this, Hoffer hypothesizes that part of the aim of joining a mass movement is a wish to escape your own individual self and retreat into a sense of group belonging. Hoffer speaks of this in quite condemnatory tones, arguing that this wish to escape yourself indicates that you're not strong enough or independent enough to tackle the world as it actually exists in an individual fashion. I'm personally a little bit more sympathetic. For most people, a sense of belonging and community is a pretty base-level need, as evidenced by the totally disastrous effects of isolation and loneliness on mental health. Given this, I suspect that a wish to lose yourself in a wider social sphere, at least some of the time, is not necessarily pathological. As Byung-Chul Han has argued, this is one of the fantastic social functions of ritual in its many and varied forms. However, the danger of fanatical movements is the level of surrender that they demand from their adherents, and so the level of surrender that the adherents are also willing to give. And we'll definitely be coming back to this in the next section. This is another thing that sets Hoffer's analysis apart from many others. Whereas a lot of people think and have thought that fanatics have essentially been duped by an unscrupulous leadership into giving up their sense of self, Hoffer thinks this is a feature of fanaticism, not a bug. In Jean-Paul Sartre's terminology, it allows the fanatic to give up a sense of their personal freedom, and so also all of the pressure and responsibility that goes along with it. Of course, this would be especially appealing if all an emphasis on personal freedom does is remind us of all the ways that we've already failed. Hoffer's observations were rather speculative at the time of writing, but surprisingly, they cohere with a lot of modern empirical evidence on this subject, particularly when it comes to cults. I feel like I'm always bringing up Stephanie Alice Baker's work on cults on the channel, but it's not my fault that she does absolutely fantastic research here. One of the main things that she identifies about cult recruitment is that they don't often rest on the strength of their doctrine or their belief system. That all comes much later, after the initiate's foot is firmly in the door. Instead, the recruiters often target isolated people who are totally dissatisfied with their lives and try to give them a sense that they belong in their movement. That is, they target the emotional needs of the initiate first and only bring in anything recognizably intellectual much, much later. In both the case of Hoffer and the case of Baker, the recruit is driven more by what they're running away from and their instinctive needs than any kind of particular promise or strength of what they're running towards. Hoffer uses this to predict that someone who is prone to being fanatical in one direction will also be rather prone to fanaticism in another, should they ever choose to abandon their original set of fanatic beliefs. More recently, Michael Hogg and Janice Alderman have argued that having an uncertain personal identity will mean that someone will be more likely to identify with wider groups, and these include fanatical groups, and that the more uncertain someone's identity is, the more likely that this group identification will become unhealthy or stretched to a pathological degree. So, Hoffer has a pretty robust characterization of the nascent fanatic. For him, it is a grave mistake to think that we are drawn to extreme movements primarily on the merits of their arguments. We are just as likely to be rather desperate, seeking belonging, and willing to take the risk that even chaos will be better than whatever we have at the moment. This does not make everyone who joins a fanatical movement totally irrational. There might be situations where taking such a risk genuinely does make sense. Hoffer is not necessarily writing his book to condemn or praise, but rather just to record what he has observed. And it turns out that his observations were not too far off the mark, at least in this respect. And it is worth noting that Hoffer is not talking about potential fanatics as though they were a totally separate species. He thinks this could happen to almost any of us, given the right circumstances. So perhaps the more valuable lesson of this analysis is not to use it to examine what we see as fanatical mass movements that we can stand apart from and judge from our metaphorical ivory tower, but using it to critique what we see as the totally reasonable movements that we ourselves consider us a part of. After all, we may find that we and the fanatic are not as different as we initially considered. But next, let's move on to an even juicier topic, the transformation of this nascent fanatic to a full-blown true believer. 2. The self and the group. One of the strangest things about cults or other fanatical movements is that they often act in ways that are totally incomprehensible to those outside the groups. They are often so odd that we wonder how anyone could be convinced to follow them. Moreover, the level of sheer loyalty experienced by a fanatic is difficult to make heads or tails of. Famously, a great many are willing to die for their beliefs, beliefs that most other people think are not just false, but patently false. One of the most infamous examples of this was the Heaven's Gate cult, where simply on the word of the leader, hundreds of adherents took their own lives. According to Hoffer, something fascinating occurs in the process of someone joining a mass movement and becoming a fanatic. They will come to place the group's needs, wishes, and desires as far, far more important than any personal desires they might have, or indeed anyone else might have. Hoffer describes this process as follows. The technique of fostering a readiness to fight and to die consists in separating the individual from his flesh and blood self. This may be done consciously in a top-down sort of way, but it can also just follow from the natural group dynamics of the movement and emerge totally organically. Hoffer outlines a number of ways that this de-individualization can occur, and each of them is pretty terrifying. The first is simple assimilation. This is where the new member is just directly drawn to identify more and more with the group, slowly seeing themselves as merely an extension of this higher body. This shouldn't be too hard, given that group identity was one of the reasons that they may have joined the movement in the first place. And look, clearly this can come in degrees. Hoffer admits that a looser kind of group identity is probably pretty helpful for human existential fulfillment, and can even help insulate someone from the sway of a mass movement. However, in its extremes, this over-identification with a group can lead to someone thinking that they would be nothing without the group, especially if they felt vulnerable and isolated before they had even joined. The second technique is what Hoffer calls make-believe. This is the kind of narrative crafting or fiction making that can make even the most heinous behavior seem justified or even glorious. As Hoffer puts it, it is one of the main tasks of a real leader to mask the grim reality of dying and killing, by evoking in his followers the illusion that they are participating in a grandiose spectacle, a solemn or light-hearted, dramatic performance. This is one reason why storytelling is so important to fanaticism. We can slowly construct a fiction where the world is fundamentally controlled by two oppositional forces, good and evil, and that each person can be neatly sorted into either camp. At this point, to display any sympathy or even understanding with the enemy is to consort with the devil. Part of this theatre is constructing an imaginary audience. This can take the shape of God or one's ancestors or just a nebulously defined eye of history. The point is that there is something or someone watching you and approving of what you do. Thirdly, there is the total condemnation of the present. This again plays into what we said earlier, since any likely recruits for any fanatical movement are going to have major problems with the present state of things. At this point, things go one step further, and the present itself is seen as a kind of enemy. This sounds a little bit abstract, but we can think about it a bit like this. Whereas before, the dissatisfied person might have wanted to change the present, now their focus is directed towards a utopian future instead. The attention is drawn away from practical or enactable ways to improve people's lives, since that would be, in some sense, thinking that the present could be made better. And this is a betrayal of the movement's ultimate dream. The advantage of pledging someone in a movement to some distant future is that you can promise a hell of a lot more. If someone was asked to lay down their life for the sake of gently improving the lives of others around them in the next few years, this sounds like not only quite a big ask, but even a little bit undignified. Whereas, if instead we're asked to sacrifice ourselves for the promise of a grand future, that we can be the hero who will usher in a new age of prosperity for us and our group, then this feels a lot more like something that we could consider worth dying for. It's no wonder that so many fanatical movements, especially ones in the past couple of centuries, have glorified hero narratives. Fourthly, we have doctrine. This is a pretty familiar idea and is, at base level, just the set of beliefs a group has. But Hoffer is more interested in how these beliefs are used, and specifically, how they can put up a fact-proof screen between the believer and the outside world. As Hoffer puts it, it is the true believer's ability to shut his eyes and stop his ears to facts that do not deserve to be either seen or heard, which is the source of his unequaled fortitude and constancy. Here, Hoffer is less fussed about what the actual contents of a doctrine are, because various fanatical movements have had very different and totally incompatible beliefs, but he identifies a few structural threats. He thinks that true fanatically inspiring doctrine must either be unintelligible or vague or unverifiable. He also thinks that certainty in the doctrine must be considered a moral good, and thus doubt is considered a moral evil. Additionally, fanatical doctrine must be, in some sense, the ultimate explanation of all things. All questions have already been answered, all decisions made, all eventualities foreseen. The idea is that when the believer is confronted with a fact or reasoned argument that contradicts doctrine, they should always side with doctrine over this fact or argument. This makes doctrine a pseudoscientific belief system under Karl Popper's definition. It has become unfalsifiable. All of this helps give the believer the impression that they are everything with the group and nothing without them. Within the confines of this movement, they have access to ultimate truth. They fight on the side of goodness for a promised future and have a meaningful connection with others. But outside the group, they are pathetic, alone, ignorant, and evil. Maybe the mark of the fanatic is not what they believe, but rather that they believe it as an axiom. Instead of their belief in the tenets of their group flowing down from their observations of the world, it becomes the lens through which all of their observations are filtered. What should be the conclusion of a line of reasoning becomes a precondition for thinking anything at all. Thus, the transformation of the vulnerable person to the fanatic is more or less complete. Hoffer does not define a set point at which someone becomes a full-blown fanatic, and I actually think that this is a strength of his account. Ultimately, we don't want fanaticism to be an all-or-nothing affair, because in practice, all of the properties that we've looked at, the emphasis on group allegiance, the claim to deeply important knowledge, the fixation on a distant future at the expense of the immediate present, these all come in degrees. Although Hoffer does not go into too much detail about gradability in his book, looking at things in this way provides a more flexible framework with which to examine our own beliefs and our own perspectives. Because it's not entirely clear that the extreme opposite of fanaticism as defined in this section is desirable in all cases. Someone who has no connection with others, who is totally skeptical of any and all knowledge, and who never thinks of the future, is not necessarily a well-adjusted person, but a kind of rogue maverick type crossed with Diogenes the Cynic. There's nothing inherently wrong with this, and the world of cinema would be much worse off without them, but it is doubtful that we could have a society entirely populated with people like this. So this raises a question. To what extent are these semi-fanatical properties desirable, and in what situations? For instance, Hoffer points out that in a time of existential conflict, you ideally want a lot more of your citizens to temporarily become patriotic fanatics, as that is what will give your nation the best chance at winning the war. Likewise, even in your everyday life, you want to be confident enough in some set of orienting beliefs so that you can act out in the world in a coherent way, without becoming so dogmatic about them that they set up that insulation between you and reality. I like approaching these properties from this angle because there is a temptation when reading a book like this to neatly divide the world into fanatics and non-fanatics and place ourselves smugly on the non-fanatic side. By using this slightly more gradable analysis, we can turn our interrogative lenses inwards and ask to what extent we too have these properties. But next, what are the key feelings of a mass movement? And what defines the experience of the fanatic? If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel or, if you're feeling incredibly generous, to the Patreon. The links are in the description. 3. The emotional world of the fanatic. One of my favorite lines in Hoffer's book reads as follows: "Mass movements can rise and spread without a belief in a god, but never without belief in a devil. Usually the strength of a mass movement is proportionate to the vividness and tangibility of its devil." This touches upon a key part of the emotional life of the fanatic. For Hoffer, it may involve love, kinship, and defense, but it absolutely must involve a sense of enemy and of injustice. The fanatic must be imbued with a feeling of ever-looming threat, and this threat must be totally catastrophic, while at the same time being overcomable if you just band together enough and achieve true unity. It reminds me of the observation by Umberto Eco that political enemies within fascist movements have both been considered too strong and also too weak. Hoffer points out that this is not limited to fascism, but is a factor in wider fanatical movements as well. The strength of outlining a devilish enemy and focusing all of the fanatics' hate and ire upon them is twofold. The first is that it gives them someone to blame for all of their problems, thus drawing them further into the movement. And the second is that it can unify people who would otherwise have pretty severe disagreements with one another. Say that you and I are of differing sects in the same religion. Ordinarily, you might find us arguing, debating, or even persecuting one another. But in the face of a strong threat from another rival religion, we will be much more likely to set aside our differences and band together in a kind of mutual hate. In this situation, the enemy of my enemy instantly becomes my friend. Hoffer also thinks that this hatred becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because whether or not we hated this group before they became the quasi-mythical enemy, once we actively begin to persecute them, we will have to hate them to assuage our guilty consciences. After we've unforgivably hurt people, the only way to not hate ourselves is to argue that they deserve it. Secondly, the fanatic eventually finds a great desire in themselves to imitate the other members of their movement. This only makes sense considering what we discussed in the last section. The fanatic now considers themselves merely a limb of this wider body, and so their most ardent desire is to become like the body in every way imaginable. This mutual imitation amongst the members of a fanatical movement ensures that the fanatics will gradually become more and more like one another, at least according to Hoffer. Interestingly, the best example of this that I've come across was a statement from O'Brien in 1984, where he says this: "Can you not understand, Winston, that the individual is only a cell? The weariness of the cell is the vigor of the organism. Do you die when you cut your fingernails?" This is, in effect, an admission by O'Brien that he is nothing more than an imitative shell of the party as a whole. It is a climactic picture of fanatical perfection. Of course, by reducing the strange multiplicity of human life to a set of copies, the movement also becomes much easier to control. Next, there is persuasion and coercion, where the fanatic gives their regular allegiance to the tenets of the movement. I won't go into too much detail here, but it effectively solidifies the belief in the doctrine that we talked about in the last section, as well as make the believer want to spread this belief to others. Then, we have the leadership and the fanatic's relationship to the leadership. Again, Hoffer places less emphasis on the actual content of a leader's belief and more on the emotional effects that they produce in this budding fanatic. He describes the primary qualities of a mass movement leader like this: "The most decisive qualities for the effectiveness of a mass movement leader seem to be audacity, fanatical faith in a holy cause, an awareness of the importance of a close-knit collectivity, and, above all, the ability to evoke fervent devotion in a group of able lieutenants." I know that a lot of my fellow Brits in the audience will feel slightly betrayed that I've said lieutenant rather than lieutenant, but in my defense, Hoffer is an American author. Importantly, the leader must display absolute, unwavering confidence in themselves and their movement. The reason for this is pretty straightforward. The fanatic has been drawn to the movement in the first place because of a sense of desperation and insecurity. They are primed to be loyal and to believe whatever is told to them, but it has to be grand enough and certain enough to re-imbue their life with a sense of meaning and purpose. Otherwise, what's the point? Whether the leader has any personal doubts or not, they must never show this, or else they won't hold this dominant position in the fanatic's mind. For the fanatic themselves, they are just awestruck by the leader and confident in the leader's supreme ability. To question such a demigod would be sheer folly. The leader becomes a holy book, and their word a holy writ. The fanatic is also constantly suspicious and constantly under suspicion themselves. This is an interesting bait and switch from the promise of community and togetherness that was originally sold to the fanatic at the beginning of this whole process. A universal suspicion is not a real community between flesh and blood people. It means that anyone at any point could become the enemy. It offers no stability or security, and I can't help but wonder how many adherents feel deceived by this change. Nonetheless, Hoffer thinks that the change is absolutely necessary for the continued survival of the mass movement. Although it may preach brotherhood or companionship, it cannot make good on these promises, since this would mean members could come to view their own private friendships as more important than the movement's overall goals. At this point, the fanaticism would have cracked, and the whole doctrinal edifice threatens to fall apart. Paradoxically, the fanatic is their own isolated agent, even as their sense of self is subsumed within this movement. They may have companions, but they can never have friends. And this brings us to what I think is the most interesting part of Hoffer's whole analysis. Because for him, the fanatic is ultimately being lied to, but in a whole host of subtle ways. They're not under any illusions as to the fact that their freedom and independence are being taken away. but they are under the impression that a real sense of permanent meaning and belonging is being put in its place. For some, this might even work temporarily, but for very few will it work for their entire life. There are even those tragic figures who end up alienated from everyone and everything because they ventured so far into fanaticism that they have nowhere left to turn if they do have doubts or begin to wrest their independent thought back again. They've become so used to subsuming themselves into a hole that they don't know how to live any other way. To again quote Hoffer directly, "Thus, people raised in the atmosphere of a mass movement are fashioned into incomplete and dependent human beings, even when they have within themselves the making of self-sufficient entities. After all, imagine truly believing that you were on a holy mission, an undertaking of complete and cosmic importance. You were told that you would be part of an ever-expanded family with love unbounded, that you were a great hero of history or of God or of fate, and that you were fighting an enormous foe, only to realize that this did not bring true fulfillment, but a life full of restless hatred, eternal suspicion, and without an escape in sight. Where else is there to go but down? At the beginning, the movement needed the support of the Fanatics, but eventually, the Fanatics themselves come to rely on the movement so much that they feel they can't leave. The alternative is the disillusionment and nihilism that often does strike people when they leave cults or find that a fundamental belief that they held may be false. The Fanatic has been sold counterfeit goods, and yet they still cannot do without those counterfeit goods. There is something almost tragic in this narrative, and I can't help but sympathize with it at some level. On a related note, it also holds a pretty important lesson for us. The Fanatic, at this moment, believes things because they don't know who they would be without the beliefs. That is, any intellectual misgivings they might have are pushed down due to the emotional consequences of potentially realizing that they got things badly wrong. But this general pattern is by no means limited to those in cults or fanatical movements. As has become a theme of the video, the difference between fanatics and non-fanatics is merely a matter of degree, and we are unlikely to be simply above holding on to our beliefs for sentimental, emotional, or otherwise flawed reasons. But lastly, let's broaden our scope slightly, because the Fanatic is not the only player in this broader game. There is a whole ideological ecosystem at play, and it's well worth having a look at. 4. The Fanatical Biome. Hoffer does not think that fanatical movements are merely matters of leaders and fanatics. There are numerous other players in here that, unwittingly or not, do contribute to the mass movement. And the thing is, they're not always doing something wrong or undesirable. The first is what Hoffer calls the men of words. We might think of these as the people in a society who have some capacity for their ideas and thoughts to be spread relatively widely. In Hoffer's day, these were journalists, academics, and public intellectuals. For all I know, that role might now expand to social media influencers and curly-haired twats with philosophy channels. Hoffer thinks that these writers or speakers fill a number of different roles. First, critics can simply discredit the current state of things. I find this particularly interesting because, of course, we do want people critiquing the present state of things. There are a lot of things about the world today that surely do warrant critique and change. Just as we don't want to totally disregard the present, we also don't want to pretend that there are no major issues with it. But Hoffer thinks that if we're not careful, these critiques of complex problems can become grist for the mill of simple answers. What might start as a complicated appraisal of a given social or economic issue, which would probably warrant an equally complicated solution, is given a single sentence answer. I would suggest that it is these simple answers that we might want to be wary of, rather than the critiques themselves. Next, there is Hoffer's other role for men of words. They build the positive case for the fanatical movement's solutions. He is neutral on whether these solutions might actually work. For all we know, they might, and Hoffer thinks that these men of words probably do believe what they're writing. But he also thinks that these careful treatments will likely just be disregarded when the mass movement is firmly in the control of charismatic leaders and fanatical followers. At that point, the emphasis will be far more on the slogans and dogmatic truths of the movement than these initial intellectual underpinnings. A little bit like the Fanatics themselves, Hoffer paints the men of words in deeply tragic colours. These are people who firmly hoped that their ideas would be taken seriously, and who thought that they might be able to change the world for the better with the aid of careful critique and complex strategizing. And yet, their ideas are used as nothing more than vague cudgels by this later movement. Any complexity is stripped away, and they're only used in as much as it props up this simplified absolute doctrine of the movement. The detailed treatment of an issue is boiled down into a short slogan, and the wordsmith themselves might even be on the bad side of the movement as it progresses. After all, once the movement is in full active swing, intellectualism of almost any kind is potentially rather dangerous, as it signals an ability to critique the inner workings of the movement itself. It carries the seeds of subversion within it, and so, in some sense, must be eliminated. Next, Hoffer turns his attention to the Fanatic themselves. Although much of the book is about the formation and solidification of a Fanatic, Hoffer thinks that the Fanatic who is too ardent in their belief actually becomes a hindrance to the movement eventually. Despite the initial strength of having an awful lot of fanatics in your ideological group, you don't actually want them to believe in the righteous cause too much, or else they might come to question the leadership by their own lights. A true fanatic is the kind of person who would turn around to a cult authority and tell them that they are misinterpreting the scriptures. And this is not submission, but the beginnings of a schism. This is the simple result of a rather banal truth. A mass movement cannot stay a mass movement forever. It must eventually settle down and become the new status quo. A revolutionary is only a revolutionary until they find themselves occupying every position of power, at which point the claim that the present state is intolerable begins to sound a little bit ironic. Finally, there are the men of action. Hoffer neatly summarizes this person's role thusly. A movement is pioneered by men of words, materialized by fanatics, and consolidated by men of action. Properly speaking, Hoffer thinks that the emergence of these men of action show that the fanatic stage of a movement is pretty much over. They have succeeded in overturning the old order and now have the task of crafting a new one in its place. This man of action is probably not a true believer and is likely to be more impressed by the mere practical successes of fanatical faith than to actually be taken in by doctrine. But ultimately, they want the chaos to come to an end now. Hoffer states that if a mass movement is brought to an end quickly by reasonable men of action, then there could be some stability, and potentially even a significant improvement in the status quo. If the mass movement had justified misgivings with the prior state of affairs, then it is this new order that should bring some kind of solution to them. However, the alternative is pretty unpleasant. Here, a new status quo is imposed, but everyone pretends like the revolution is still happening. In this case, the dream of some distant future can still be sold to former fanatics, but now there is no real attempt to achieve it, and Hoffer is pretty confident that this will breed major corruption within this new order. Hoffer closes the book by offering a few remarks on what he thinks makes a good fanatical movement. That is, one that minimizes bloodshed as much as possible and has the potential to bring about genuine improvement. First, he thinks their aims should be specific. It is much easier to settle down a movement when their goal is definite, like replacing a monarchy with a republic, or securing freedom of religion, rather than vague and ill-defined, like bringing about a utopian state. Second, the leaders should be aware of this natural end and not try to prolong the movement further. Attempts should be made to dissemble the mass movement back into individuals when the battle is won. Hoffer's prime example of this is when a nation goes from being one unified force in a defensive war to a more disparate society in peacetime. Thirdly, when instituting a new status quo, the movement should lean towards granting people a greater degree of freedom of thought so that the fanaticism can naturally dissipate and critical thinking re-enters the equation. The thread that binds all of these together is that the good fanatical movement for Hoffer is the one that lays the groundwork for its own dissolution, that baked into the very foundation is a time where the swords can be turned back into plowshares. I wanted to end on this note, because it really contextualizes Hoffer's view on fanaticism and fanatical movements. He does sometimes think they are either necessary or inevitable, but he sees them as inherently unstable tools that must be managed incredibly carefully, lest they leave us with something even worse than before. At different points, the true believer is painted as a victim, an aggressor, a tragic hero, and a radioactive substance. But for Hoffer, the thing they absolutely must be is temporary. But if you want to get an entirely different perspective on fanaticism and the dangers of having too much meaning, then you can check out my video on Albert Camus' fascinating book, The Rebel, right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.